The physician Argentine, the last of his attendants whose services the king enjoyed, reported that the young king, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. These are the words written by the Italian friar Dominic Mancini. They are foreshadowing the most tragic event of the Wars of the Roses. This was England's civil war in the 15th century. It was fought between the houses York and Lancaster. Most likely, neither the 12-year-old Edward V nor his 2-year younger brother Richard escaped the tower. Both probably died by the order of the man that was supposed to be their protector. Mancini lived in London from before the death of King Edward IV until after the coronation of Richard III, the man who wasn't supposed to become king but to protect the boys. The Italian friar had several informants in the English capital, including the physician of the boy King Edward, a man called John Argentine. Therefore, Mancini's work is one of the most important sources that allow insight in this tragic mystery. What was the fate of the so-called princess in the tower? I invite you to join me on my deep dive about what we know, which evidence exists, and which theories are widespread, including some conspiracies. And we will also talk about ghosts, but just a little bit. Before we start, I must introduce you to the main characters of this tragedy. We must deal with the problem. A lot of Edwards and Richards are running around during the time of the Wars of the Roses. You will see this yourself. I will try to keep it simple. Richard III. Richard was born in 1452. He was the youngest son of Richard of York and Cecily Neville. His oldest brother Edward was King Edward IV. Richard was the uncle of Edward V. He died in 1485 during the Battle of Bosworth. He was the Duke of Gloucester, and he was said to have a good relationship to the family of his brother's wife Elizabeth, the Woodvilles. I refer to him by his name: Gloucester, Protector, and Uncle of the King. Elizabeth Woodville. She was the daughter of Richard Woodville and Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Her first marriage was with a man called Sir John Grey. She also was one of the ladies-in-waiting of Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou. Her first husband died in 1461 during the Second Battle of St. Albans. Elizabeth had 2 sons with her first husband. They were called Richard Grey and Thomas Grey. The latter would become the Hesse of Dorset. She married Edward IV in secret in 1464. Since she was from lower nobility and the marriage was in secret, she was never accepted by a lot of members of the royal court. She aggravated the problem by bringing members of her family into high-ranking positions. Her brother, Anthony Rivers, was one of the closest advisors to Edward IV and caretaker of Edward V. Her younger brother married the almost 70 years older Catherine Neville. She and Edward IV, Lord Chamberlain William Lord Hastings, competed for the attention of the king. Therefore, they had a strained relationship. Elizabeth and Edward had no less than 10 children. 2 of them were boys, the aforementioned Edward and Richard. I refer to her as Queen by her name or as Mother of the King. William Baron Hastings. He was born around 1430 into a house of loyal servants to the Dukes of York. William fought early at the side of Edward IV and was present at his proclamation as king. 1 year later, he married the sister of the so-called kingmaker Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who was said to be the most powerful person in England during that time. Hastings didn't really hate the Woodvilles, but was their natural rival due to his tight connection to Edward IV. I refer to him as William or Hastings. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. He was born in 1455 and was a cousin of Edward IV and therefore, of course, of Richard III as well. Ironically, he had also a family connection to the Tudors. Henry was forced into a marriage with Elizabeth's sister Catherine, who was younger than him. Henry was 10 when the wedding took place. The marriage was very unhappy, even so it produced 5 children. He probably hated the Woodvilles because of the marriage and sought a friendly connection to Richard III early on. I refer to him by his name or Buckingham. Edward V. He was born in 1470 as the 4th child of Elizabeth and Edward. 1 year later he became the Prince of Wales and therefore the heir to the throne. He was mostly raised by his uncle, Anthony Rivers, who was his closest confidant. He was one of the princes in the Tower. I refer to him as King, Boy King, or by his name. Richard of Shrewsbury. Richard was born 1473 as the 6th child of Edward and Elizabeth. He became the Duke of York in 1474. In 1478, only 4 years old, he married the 5-year-old Anne Mowbray because his father wanted to get access to her inheritance. Anne died in 1482. The moment his father died and his brother became king, he was the heir to the throne and therefore a danger for everyone wanting it for themselves. Richard was the other prince in the Tower. I refer to him by his name, the younger prince, and as brother of the king. March 30th, 1483. King Edward IV suffers from an illness. He has a slight fever. His physicians suspect that it is a result of the monarch's regular use of emetics. Nobody suspects that he won't recover. Or, as it is stated in the Chronicle of Croyland, the king neither worn out with old age nor yet seized with any known kind of malady. The French diplomat Philippe de Comines shared his own explanation when he heard about the unexpected illness. Edward fell ill because of the French superiority that was threatening England after a planned marriage failed. Edward tried to marry one of his daughters to the Dauphin. The French diplomat wrote, "But let them say what they please." The general opinion was his grief at the consummation of this marriage caused the illness. April 9th, 1483. Edward IV succumbs to his illness. According to the Croyland Chronicle, his will was finished for a long time, but he adapts it on his deathbed. Edward decides that his brother Richard should be protector of the realm during the minority of his son. Thomas More, who wrote 30 years after Edward's death, quotes his last words. They are a plea for unity. Therefore, in these last words that I ever look to speak with you, I exhort you and I require you all, for the love that I have ever bore to you, for the love that our Lord bears to us all. From this time forward, all griefs forgotten, each of you love the other, which I verily trust you will, if you anything earthly regard, either God or your king, affinity or kindred, this Rome, your own country, or your own surety. More also shares another quote that seems to foreshadow what will happen. Edward doesn't rule out that it could be better for his sons to die instead of having another civil war. The less lost were they, if taken by God at his pleasure, for yet should the Rome always find kings, and by chance good kings. The editors of the Thomas More studies interpret the part about the pleasure of God as limited to a death from natural causes. I don't agree this can be accepted with certainty. The following days. The Woodville majority on the Royal Council overrides Edward's last wish regarding his brother Richard. Instead, they decide that Edward V should start his reign as an adult immediately. They also create a new council to advise the king which Richard should preside, but not more. Further decisions are Edward V, who was in Wales at the moment of his father's death, shall arrive in London on May the 1st. His coronation shall take place on May the 4th. It seems there were some Star Wars fans on the council after all. Mancini reports that the Woodvilles decide this way because they feared Richard of Gloucester. Right after these decisions, disputes start. The Woodvilles and Richard's side fight over the size of Edward's escort. The Queen finally writes to her son it shouldn't exceed more than 2,000 men. Richard also disagrees with the idea that the Woodvilles would be caretakers of the king. He describes them as persons insolent, vicious, and of inordinate avarice. However, in direct communication with them, he sounds completely different. He promises the Queen and the Council that he would serve Edward V as loyal as he served his brother. The Croyland Chronicle describes these letters as promises that he would shortly arrive and assurances of all duty, fealty, and due obedience to his King and Lord Edward V, the eldest son of the deceased king, his brother, and of the Queen. The quote already points to an interesting fact. Richard wasn't in London at this time, but in the north. Mancini writes that William Lord Hastings informed him about everything happening in the council. Moore quotes Richard several times in contact with his allies. For example, however, a great peril is growing if we suffer this young king to remain in our enemy's hands, who, without the king's awareness, might abuse the name of his commandment to any of our undoing, which thing God and good provision forbid, and of such good provision none of us has anything the less need because of the late-made atonement in which the king's pleasure had more place than the party's wills. Nor none of us, I believe, is so unwise to trust too soon a new friend made of an old foe, or to think that a slight kindness suddenly contracted in 1 hour, continued yet scant a fortnight, should be deeper settled in their stomachs than a long accustomed malice many years rooted. Even if Richard didn't write these lines, there's one thing for sure. They highlight the tensions between the factions. Other sources report that men in arms supporting the Queen and Richard arrive in London. The allies of the late king's brother also repeatedly push him to travel to the capital as soon as possible, and especially Hastings is worried. He fears the love of the young king to his mother's family. Their worries grow when Richard's allies try to postpone the decision about the coronation date to give the king's uncle the chance to be present. The Woodville majority rejects this idea. They would be quite important enough to take decisions and see them enforced, sent by the Marquess of Dorset. According to Mancini, Hastings even fears for his life. April 29th, 1483. Richard and the Duke of Buckingham, accompanied by an army, reached the king's convoy. They proposed to Edward's caretakers to travel together to London. Not only his uncle Anthony Lord Rivers accompanies the king, but also his half-brother Richard Grey and the knight Thomas Vaughan. The latter was the chief of chamber of the 12-year-old king. Richard suggests having a feast to celebrate the start of his nephew's rule. The men accept. The time together was said to be moist and merry. April 30th, 1483. It happens in a town called Stony Stratford. Richard has the king's companions arrested. He accuses them of treason. Richard hands the men over to the care of loyal followers. After the arrests, Richard and Buckingham ride as fast as possible to the king to get him under their control. They swear loyalty to him, but assure him that his confidence had planned treason. Edward refuses to believe those words and vouches for his uncle and his half-brother. According to Moore, Buckingham answers that the men had successfully concealed their dark plans from the king. Edward replies he has full confidence in the nobility of his kingdom and in his mother. Buckingham counters that governing isn't women's business. Edward should forget this idea. According to Mancini, the young king understands in this moment that he is in captivity. The Queen receives message about these events before midnight on the very same day. She flees together with her remaining children into the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey. It is the second time Elizabeth Woodville seeks refuge at this place. The first time was more than 12 years ago, when Edward IV had to flee because the capital was about to be captured by an army riding under the banner of Henry VI. According to John Roos, who described Edward V's fate during the journey to London as one of an innocent lamb falling into the hand of wolves, the Queen took her possessions with her into the sanctuary. This is maybe an information based on the rumors that the Queen and her other son, Thomas Grey, planned to steal the fortune of Edward IV, but there wasn't anything to steal. The late king left his heirs only £1,200. May the 4th. Edward reaches London on the day when he was supposed to be crowned. The coronation gets pushed back for 7 weeks. The new date is June 22nd. The city celebrates the arrival of the new king. Edward meets the mayor, the sheriffs, and the older men of the capital. They all swear loyalty to him. Laws are confirmed in the name of the new king. Coins with his image are minted. Edward moves into an episcopal palace. The following days, the council votes that Richard becomes protector of the realm. He promises to crown his nephew. Polydor the Gill quotes him with the words that he prays to God that he wouldn't be careful for the amenities of his nephews. Hastings is in contact with the Queen and promises that no one would be crowned but their son. According to the Gill, he means it. He is most vehement and earnest that Edward should be crowned. This brings Hastings direct conflict with Richard. The protector calls reinforcements and has the church asylum of Westminster surrounded. Officially, this is done for the safety of those who have fled there, but Richard also wants to ensure that neither the Queen nor her confidants can move through the city without his knowledge. May 9th, 1483, the protector decides Edward must move. He is transferred into the Tower of London, which he will most likely never leave again. Richard explains this decision with safety concerns. Edward takes residence in the Garden Tower, which is today's Bloody Tower. Richard moves in the opulent mansion Crosby Place on Bishopsgate. The rest of May and the beginning of June, the situation seems to turn in favor of the Queen. The council denies Richard's request to have Rivers and the 2 other men executed. The Queen even attends a council meeting at the beginning of June, but she doesn't speak. Richard tries to convince the public that his actions are justified. His men prepare a wagon full of weapons and armor to prove the Woodville's treachery, but without success. Richard and Hastings distance themselves from each other further and further. Complaints are made public that the protector doesn't do enough to guarantee the safety and the dignity of the Queen. Richard demands she hands over her other son that shares his name. Brother of the king shall comfort Edward in the Tower. June 11th, 1483. Richard calls for help. He writes letters to loyal servants. They shall come in arms to support him. One of these documents is saved in a compendium called the Peston Papers or Peston Letters. In this letter, Richard asks his servant to come as fast as possible. The coronation is 11 days away. Everybody expects that Edward V will demand afterwards that Rivers, his half-brother, and Vaughan must be released from prison. Richard's reign as protector is supposed to end on the day of the coronation. The situation for the uncle of the king is dire, but he adapts to the new circumstances. Richard divides the council. One half meets with him at Crosby Place. It consists of loyal allies. The other half continues to meet in the tower in proximity to the king. June 13, 1483. The dice are cast. Richard schedules a meeting council at the tower. The protector is late, but the meeting starts friendly. Suddenly, the uncle of the king leaves for an hour. He returns with armed men. Richard accuses the Queen of trying to kill him by means of sorcery. Hastings, who became an enemy of the Protector, says that the Queen should be punished if those words are true. The answer isn't good enough for Richard. He accuses Hastings to be a traitor and to plan his destruction. The whole tower starts to shout the word traitor. Rumors say the shouts even spread through the whole city. Hastings gets executed right away. We don't know if Edward is an eyewitness, but he hears it with certainty. The other council members are arrested. The men supporting the young king and the queen surrender. Hastings is buried next to his friend Edward IV in Windsor. June 16, 1483. Richard celebrates the next success. The Queen hands over her second son, Prince Richard. The Archbishop of Canterbury convinces Elizabeth Woodville to surrender his son to the Protector. He promises that the boy will play an important role during the coronation of his brother. Right after this event, he would be sent back to his mother. The Archbishop vouches with his body and soul for the safety of the prince. According to Moore, Buckingham pressured Queen IV. He accused her of perversity in regards to her younger son. The Queen didn't budge to this, so Buckingham threatened her directly. Moore writes he told her that the sanctuary could do little to impede men that wanted to come and get her son. June 17, 1483. A bombshell news makes its rounds in the city of London. The coronation is cancelled. The same applies for the parliament that was supposed to open 2 days after the coronation. Questions arise if Edward is still alive. One letter out of the Sealy papers, which is from this time, gives the good impression what normal people thought about the events. The writer, a merchant, asks God to save the king's life if he should be still alive. June 22nd, 1483. On the day of the postponed coronation, a man called Dr. Ralph Shah preaches a sermon. He claims the marriage between Edward IV and the Queen was invalid, since the late king was already tied to a woman called Eleanor Butler. Therefore, the children of the marriage are illegitimate. Richard is the true heir to the throne. Interestingly, Vergil reports a completely different version. In his writing, Edward IV is the bastard. His father wasn't Richard of York, but a fling of his mother. Since the Protector is the only legitimate son of Richard of York, he shall be king. Moore writes this version was discussed but refused because of a veto of the mother of Edward IV and Richard. There could be a true element in this. The mother was so furious about the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville that she threatened to denounce her son as a bastard. June 25th, 1483. Buckingham repeats Shah's accusations in the Guildhall of London. According to Moore, it takes several tries and paid people until the crowd screams for a King Richard. Later, a law is passed that makes the bastard allegations official. It will be revoked under Henry VII, so after the events in the Guildhall, Richard and his allies meet. Buckingham offers him the crown. Richard refuses several times, but finally accepts for the sake of the realm. June 26, 1483. Richard is officially declared king. The news spread that Rivers, Edward's half-brother, and Vaughan were executed the day before. Mancini reports that Richard changed his clothing style even before the official declaration. After Hastings' execution, he dispensed the colors of mourning and showed himself in royal purple. July 6, 1483. The coronation of Richard and his wife Anne Neville takes place. The former protector benefited from the fact that a lot of preparations were made for his nephew's coronation could be used. The princes are isolated. Most of their servants are dismissed. The last document showing payment for the staff of Edward and his brother Richard is from the middle of July. July 1483. Mancini reports the princes are moved into the inner apartments of the tower. This probably means they now reside in the White Tower. Their public sightings are getting less and less, but they still play in the garden of the tower and practice archery. Their removal to the inner apartments was a reaction to a plot that was revealed to Richard at the end of July. Well, at least maybe it was a reaction to this. Several people tried to set them free. One of the conspirators was a member of Edward IV's household. The other one was a senior official of the tower. Both men were executed. The plot was planned and supported by people from the south and the west of the Rome, the Chronicle reports. The conspirators even contacted Henry Tudor for support. The plot probably sealed the fate of the princess. Many researchers think that Richard gave the command to kill the boys afterwards. They were too dangerous to be alive. Them being dead was what everyone thought in the capital. Mazzini reports everyone in the city started to cry when the conversation touched the boys. The people were sure their uncle had been killed. But September 29, 1483, according to the Great Chronicle of London, this day marks the last confirmed sighting of Edward V. There are arguments to support Richard had his nephews killed only now, because 5 days earlier Buckingham turned on him. The sons of Edward IV would have been great replacements for Richard. Too young to rule, but with a legitimate claim. November 1483. All of Europe operates under the assumption that the princes are dead and were killed by the now King Richard III. But what happened? Some unsolved mysteries haunt the hearts and minds of men for centuries. The unknown fate of the princess in the tower is one of them. Did Richard III really kill the boys, as so many writers want us to believe? Not least Shakespeare, whose stage play shaped a lot of the image we still have of the man. It is the job of historians to answer this question. Let's have a look what this means and which results come to light. Historians use, this will be a great shock, historical method. It's based on the historical critical method that was developed during the 18th and 19th century. It always starts with the question, what do we want to know from the past? Well, our question is rather simple. What happened to the princess in the tower? Now we must look for the right sources. This procedure is called heuristics. The word sources has a different meaning for historians as for many other disciplines. They are first-hand testimonials, or as close as possible to first-hand testimonials. Historians usually work with written, painted, drafted, or sculptured sources. Later works, for example, writings from historians, are called literature. For our topic, we will restrict ourselves to written sources. There are a lot of paintings, but almost all of them were created much later. For example, this one is probably the most famous of them all. It was painted by John Everett Millais in 1878. This means it's much closer to our time than to the Princess in the Tower. Other famous paintings like this and this are also closer to us than to the actual events. There's another problem. The Tudor era was in full-on propaganda mode against Richard. They owed their throne to the fact that Henry VII defeated him, so Richard had to be the bad guy. One nice example is this picture of Edward V, which is from Tudor or Stuart times. It's very similar to the one of Edward VI, and that is very likely by design to highlight the continuation from Edward IV's descendants to the Tudors. Henry VII was married to Edward IV's daughter Elizabeth of York after all. The only contemporary picture we have of Edward V is this. He was 6 years old. But written sources suffer from the identical problem as the paintings. The historical critical method therefore intends to examine them critically, meaning we have to ask some questions. Which sources exist? Who wrote them? What else do we know about their background? What do we know about their credibility? What did other historians find out about them? Written sources are generally divided into diplomatic and narrative documents. Diplomatic documents are all official writings and letters, think deeds or laws. We have some of them for the princes in the tower, but they stay mostly silent about their fate. The Compendia of the Pestle Letters and the Sealy Papers, as well as the Statutes of the Rome, are exceptions. Narrative sources of interest for our question are chronicles and contemporary historical works. We have the following writings to help us find an answer. Dominic Mancini, The Usurpation of Richard III, Thomas More, The History of King Richard III, Polydor Vergil, Leclerc Historia, Alison Henham's translation is used, John Roos' History of the Kings of England, the second continuation of Ingolf's Chronicle of the Abbey of Croyland, better known as the Croyland Chronicle, Philippe de Comines, Memoirs, Jean Molinet, Chroniques, Robert Fabian, maybe him, it's unclear if he's really the writer, The Great Chronicle of London. Mancini's work is the most important one since he was in the capital when most or all of the events happened. But he himself writes that he isn't sure about a lot of things, doesn't give a lot of dates, and doesn't know every name. Most of the other sources are Tudor-era writings and therefore to handle with special care. Thomas More's work gives the most details about the events, but is from decades later. As mentioned, he lived during the time of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. More was only 5 years old when the boys disappeared. Furthermore, he was on the payroll of Henry VIII when he wrote the history about Richard III. There isn't a single source that doesn't name Richard as the person responsible for the fate of the princes. All the writers think he had them killed. Mancini adds that he doesn't know how it went down, the same is to acknowledge for the Croyland Chronicle. So, what now? The historical critical method dictates to compare the explanations and to seek other supporting sources. We don't like the word proof. That is a term for judges and lawyers, especially when we talk about a mystery that is unsolved for centuries. We have 3 sources talking about the death in more detail, but we can rule Molinet out. With the exception of Richard, he doesn't give us a name. The other 2 sources are Vergil and More. They are both very similar in their description. They both date the killing in July or August 1483. Vergil writes Richard wanted Robert Breckenbury to do it. He was the constable of the tower. But the man feared for his safety. Therefore, Richard asked Sir James Tyrrell. According to Vergil, the type of death isn't sure, but the new king didn't keep the murder a secret for long. Richard started talking about it. It should be noted, historian can't confirm him talking about his nephews. More basically agrees with the descriptions until Tyrrell gets the assignment. According to this source, a courtier recommended Tyrrell. More writes that Richard's men for the dirty work got the keys for the tower from Brackenbury. The boys had only one servant left, called Black Will. Tyrrell sent a certain John Dighton and Miles Forrest, who was one of the guards of the princes, into their chamber to kill them. According to Moore, the boys were suffocated with their pillows at midnight. Afterwards, Tyrrell was brought in. He ordered to have the boys buried under a staircase in the White Tower. This one. We actually have supporting arguments for Moore's version. Tyrrell was a prisoner in the tower himself in 1502. He confessed to the version Moore would later write down. Dighton corroborated Tyrrell's account. Furthermore, the White Tower underwent some renovations in 1674. Under the staircase, the remains of the 2 children were found. They were examined in the 1930s. Sadly, the work was done horribly. But the bones would fit to the boys. However, there is no DNA testing to be sure. That might change soon. I talk about it in the last part of this video. Historian Tim Thornton was able to examine that Moore knew the sons of the named men. It was still hearsay, but Moore got as close as possible. So why isn't this case closed? First, Thornton's amazing work is from 2020, was basically published 3 seconds ago for medieval history. Second, there are still problems at Halls. Tyrrell was probably tortured, so his accounts are to be taken with a grain of salt. Moore writes that Dighton walked free. This seems odd. We are talking about a murderer of a king who was the brother of the current queen. One explanation could be that Dighton made what we would call a plea deal nowadays. That would mean he confirmed Tyrrell's descriptions, true or false, in order to live and to walk. But still, this is weird. Just weird. And there's another point. Dighton also claims that the bodies of the boys were moved afterwards. Brackenbury was ordered to give them a proper burial by none other than Richard. Dighton claimed he didn't know where the new place was, but there were bones at the original place. Did Dighton invent the movement of the bones? If so, why? Are there not the remains of the boys? As long as there is no DNA test of the bones that are buried in Westminster Abbey in our time, the historical critical method can't help us anymore. Luckily, the historical science made a lot of progress since the 19th century. The modern historical method now wants us to make good use of other fields' concepts. But how does this work? I will try to explain it simply. We can attribute everything that has already happened not only to history, but also to other disciplines. So, the science of history uses instruments of the other fields to find an answer. You may know this from the fact that many social science theories can be found in historical works. It is important to know that the choice of a tool from another discipline can have a significant impact on the outcome. In our case, we start from a crime. We operate under the assumption it was murder. I know there are other theories as well. These will be the subjects of the next 2 chapters of this documentary. In criminology, the question cui bono is a common tool for identifying perpetrators. It is the Latin term for who benefits. The underlying logic is that the person who benefits the most from a crime has the greatest motive to commit it. The person in question is therefore the likely perpetrator. Cicero masterfully used the question as an exculpatory tool in a defense speech in 80 BC. Since then, it has gained great prominence. So the question for us is, who benefits from the death of the princess in the tower the most? In the end, there are only 2 candidates. Richard obviously benefits, becomes king instead of his nephew. Moore, who refers to the protector with, let's say, colorful descriptions such as he was malicious, wrathful, envious, and from before his birth, ever perverse, assumes that Richard planned to grab the crown from the moment of his brother's death. Moore quotes one of the protector's servants named Potter from the night of Edward IV passing as follows: "Then will my master the Duke of Gloucester be king." Virgil also implies that Richard planned from the beginning to grab the crown. Historical research, however, disagrees. Those who believe Richard to be the murderer admit that this decision could have been made after Edward V had clearly declared his loyalty for his mother's family, and that Richard's ally Hastings did not want to see anyone else on the throne than Edward IV's son. Dan Jones argues Richard wanted to fulfill his duty as protector in loyalty to his brother's legacy, but thereby maneuvered himself into such a hopeless situation that he could only become king himself. For Jones, the execution of Hastings is a sign of Richard's growing paranoia. The second candidate who benefited was Henry Tudor. The death of the 2 princes moved him well up the line of candidates for the throne. He only had to get rid of Richard to become king himself. Philippa Gregory therefore made his mother, Margaret Beaufort, the principal of the murders in her well-known book series about the Wars of the Roses. In this context, however, some practical questions arise. How did Margaret Beaufort get access to the tower? Could she really be sure that her son could one day assemble sufficient forces to defeat Richard? And would there have been any need for the murders of the children at all? Henry was the heir to the Lancaster line and therefore did not necessarily have to take second place to the Yorks in the question of succession to the throne, especially not after a war had been won. The most plausible answer to cui bono is therefore Richard. However, cui bono has its limits as a principle and is therefore not welcome in court as the only basis for argumentation. The reason can be described with further Latin vocabulary. I'm sure you want to hear more Latin. The expression being cum hoc ergo propter hoc. Translated, those words read, with this, therefore because of this. This means that there can be apparent causalities. Only because things occur together, this does not mean they condition each other. The strongest motive does not always have to be the one that makes the difference. As an example, as mentioned in the first part, Richard of Shrewsbury was married to Anne Mowbray when he was only 4 years old. In 1489, his father made him Duke of Norfolk and thus Earl of Nottingham. This caused considerable ill feelings among the ranks of the Mowbrays and other possible heirs. John Howard, later a loyal returner of Richard III, and at the same time the new Duke of Norfolk after the disappearance of the boys, may be cited as an example. So for his part he had a strong motive, but is rarely considered because Richard's motive was stronger. And this whole example does not even address the not at all unlikely possibility that other people may have had motives unknown to us. So how do we deal with this? The bitter answer is we must be satisfied with an approximation. Therefore, we turn the matter around and ask about the responsibility. Who should have protected Edward V and his younger brother from this? The answer is clear: Richard of Gloucester. After all, the name protector alone says this. Regardless of whether the prince's uncle in the tower was the principal for the perpetrators or not, the following applies in any case. No matter what happened to the boys, it was his responsibility to prevent it. And the tower was not just any prison, but one of the most secure fortifications of the time. There's a reason why the idea of having Edward V moved to the tower for his safety was met with general approval. As long as the tower staff was on his side, he indeed would have been safe there. And so, in the end, all traces lead back to Richard III. The boys were in his charge in a highly secured facility. He dismissed virtually all the children's servants and withdrew the boys to the inner apartments of the complex. He had authority over the security guards. He was blamed by several people. It was his followers who publicly proclaimed the illegitimacy of the princess, and he profited considerably by taking the crown. Those who pose Richard as the principal, however, argue that he had already achieved his goals the moment his nephews were declared illegitimate. Those who are convinced of his perpetration argue the attempted liberation of the princess from the tower in the summer of 1483 showed Richard that they should not be allowed to live. If it was murder, then Richard is without question the prime suspect. But was it? Was it really murder? Let's talk about it. This part of the video must begin with the trigger warning. After we dealt with the light-hearted topic of the murder of children of royal blood, we have a similar light-hearted topic coming up, the possible suicide of children of royal blood. If you don't want to hear anything about this, you should skip this part. And I also already hear the doubting voices and see cursors circling over the close button when it comes to possible suicide. I promise I'm not completely insane. Stay with me and see for yourself. As presented, it is commonly assumed the princes were murdered in the tower. The common alternative is that they were secretly released from prison or freed and lived in anonymity. We addressed this idea in the next section, but this much can already be said. There have repeatedly been impostors claiming to be one of the princes. Perkin Warbeck is a well-known example who pretended to be Richard of Shrewsbury. However, one thesis has never been discussed, well, to my knowledge at least. It could have been suicide. Perhaps Edward killed himself and his brother to escape their fate. Right off the bat, this seems unbelievable and unimaginable, and I don't blame you if you think it is just crazy. The question immediately arises whether a 12-year-old is even capable of such an act. We know from our time that it is possible. I am omitting examples due to the sensitivity of the subject, but they are only Google search away. Sources would support a suicide to some extent. Remember Dr. John Argentine, who reported to Mancini that Edward confessed his sins every day and prepared himself for his death? John Molyneux, however, solved with great credibility problems, gives a similar account from the tower. Edward was very melancholy and told his brother that it would be better for the two princes to die. He puts the following words into Edward's mouth: "I think we shall not long remain in the world." More reports that Edward only cared about his brother, but not himself. This speaks to a severe depression. Edward also at least heard, if not saw, the execution of Hastings. In addition, he may have known that many relatives from his mother's family were executed. He might have understood that he too was in great danger. So what if Edward not only suspected that death was coming but knew it? Would he benefit in a cui bono sense? Well, apart from losing his life, of course. In fact, this is the case. It was clear Edward's uncle would be blamed for his death. Edward would have placed Richard's reign forever under a dark shadow. He would have spared him and his brother alive in prison, which probably would have ended in execution at some point anyway. What we know otherwise also fits in. Richard could not present the boys' bodies because suicide would have never been considered possible. No one believed the Yorks that Henry VI had died of melancholy in the Tower. In this respect, Richard already had his own experience. Therefore, he could not have the princes buried appropriately, but had to choose a place where the bodies would not be found. A staircase was suitable for this, but Tyrell's confession contradicts the assumption of a suicide. However, this is only true if we take it at face value. Henry VII and his wife Elizabeth wanted Richard to be the guilty party. It is possible that they got what they wanted. This need not to even have been necessarily malicious. Suicide would unquestionably have seemed very unlikely in the interrogation. If Edward wanted to hurt his uncle in the most effective way, suicide would be an excellent solution. However, there are also counter-arguments. First, suicide is and was a sin. Edward was an outspoken Christian, which may have meant a problem. Second, there is the question of how exactly his brother died, if the thesis is correct. Suicide as well? Or was he killed by his brother? Third, in the situation of the princess in the tower, it was not uncommon to confess one's sins every day and feel victimized. And fourth, we have the following quote from Edward, handed down by Moore, when he learned that his uncle had become king. "Alas, I would my uncle would let me have my life yet, though I lose my kingdom." This does not sound like he wanted to die. How plausible is a suicide? The answer depends on three questions. First, how much of the descriptions of Edward's state of mind do we believe? Second, what can a 12-year-old be expected to do? Third, how does Richard's disappearance fit in? I can only answer these questions subjectively. It seems logical to me that Edward was depressed. Not only had he lost his father and father figure in the form of Anthony Lord Rivers, but he had also witnessed much violence directed against his family and other men. In addition, his honorable upbringing was publicly revoked. I cannot say how severe a possible depression was, but that it existed seems plausible. What can we expect of a 12-year-old? We see Edward quite confident in the sources. He disagrees with Buckingham and Richard after the arrest of his confidants and vouches for his uncle and half-brother. He stands firmly by his mother's family, so much so that the entire drama probably unfolded in the first place. He appears mature for his age, but just as deeply religious. If this is correct, I think Edward killed his brother to spare him the sin of suicide and to save him from a life of captivity. However, I do not consider suicide the most likely possibility. After all, the situation was not completely hopeless for the family, since the Queen and the other children were not in the hands of Richard. However, it is unclear how much the two princes actually know about the current situation. Third, the sin factor is of enormous importance. I therefore think it is more likely the boys were murdered by their uncle. However, one should not completely leave out of sight the possibility of suicide. What if it was completely different? What if Edward V really reacted as described by Moore? And what if Richard wanted to take his nephew at his words? Did the two princes possibly survive? Yes, says a major project that presented its findings some time ago, but it has a clear bias. John Evans is a name that is rather unknown even among medieval historians, yet he is supposed to be the key to what happened to the princes in the tower. According to this, they lived, well, at least one of them in the person of Edward V. So claims the Missing Princess project, which is closely connected to the Richard III Society. And this is a problem. I will get in more detail about it in this section. If you want to skip it and move ahead to the findings of the project, you can see the timecode now. The Missing Princess project was launched by Philippa Langley. She made headlines in 2012 when her Looking for Richard project succeeded in finding the York King remains in a car park in Leicester. There's an excellent documentary on this, in which Langley herself speaks widely. I link to the associated videos. Some of the images I show as part of this video are from the documentary and the work of the project. Langley launched the Missing Princess project a few years later and gave the following rationale. Put simply, it is to help move our knowledge forward and to attempt to finally come to a definitive conclusion about this enduring royal mystery. The very next sentence describes a problem of which any person engaged in the work of the project must be aware. The Looking for Richard project, which discovered Richard III in a car park in Leicester, succeeded because it was prepared to question rather than simply repeat traditional history. Later, Langley also states, the strategy is unequivocal. Only by questioning received wisdom and dogma can we hope to move our knowledge forward, to learn and to discover. This may sound good and right at first reading. Who can be against learning new things and moving our knowledge forward? However, it is problematic to describe the current state of knowledge as dogma. This implies that it is wrong. For their part, the Ricardians, as the members and sympathizers of the Richard III Society called themselves, work in a way that very often seems as if they already had the answer, namely Richard was good, to which they were exclusively looking for the evidence. Here are some quotes from various websites of the Ricardians. I will not read them aloud completely, but focus on the main parts of concern. Like-minded people is a problematic term when one's self-description is built on the word belief. It's almost ironic to refuse dogmas given this sentence. The next screenshot. And again the word belief. Moving on. Of course, there's also an answer to the all-important question of this series and the Missing Princess project. Did Richard kill his nephews? Here's the answer. Yep, the bones are omitted from the answer. I have presented a large part of the sources in more detail. I leave it to you to come to your own judgment in this regard. Another quote from richardthird.net is also problematic. We publish two regular journals, our members magazine, the Ricardian Bulletin, and the more scholarly publication, the Ricardian, which is also targeted at academic audiences. Terms like more scholarly and also targeted to academic audience do not inspire the greatest confidence. But why do Ricardians believe Richard was a good king? Here's their answer. Feel free to pause if you would like to read it in detail, but in short, he did some things that were kept by the Tudors and therefore were proven to be valuable. Explicit regarding the thrust is the FAQ section of the Ricardians homepage, which is devoted to the king's alleged misdeeds. For instance, This is an example of whataboutism in order to not have to answer the question, because it would have to be answered in the affirmative. The next example. This is simply not true. Buckingham, one of the closest allies of Richard, until then was responsible. On this page we get even more opinions regarding the princess in the tower. Again, please feel free to pause. I have no objection to the first paragraph, except for the fact that Richard was not to become protected by council decision, but only the presiding member of the council. A regency in the French sense was probably not even intended by Edward IV. However, this is an open question. But I have major objections to the last two paragraphs, which we must therefore look at more closely. The Ricardians cannot explain Richard's actions in capturing the Woodvilles. They reject what they find in the sources because they were written after Richard's end. The Ricardians, however, are really to attribute a responsible role to Buckingham. However, they can also only have inferred his actions from the sources. Richard was not the designated protector as per the sources. Accordingly, this argument does not work, which is regrettable, because of course it was completely appropriate for him, as the uncle of the king and as the brother of the late king, and as the most important nobleman of the country, to accompany the new King Edward V to London. Let's look at an excerpt from Mancini about the council meeting in question. Two opinions were propounded. One was that the Duke of Gloucester should rule because Edward in his will had so directed, and because by law the government should devolve on him. But this was the losing resolution. The winning was that the government should be carried out by many persons, among whom the Duke, far from being excluded, should be accounted the chief. By this means, the Duke would be given due honor and the royal authority greater security. Another problematic answer to a question is this. Once again, the Ricardians avoid the word yes that would have to be given as an answer to this question. After all, it dealt with the existence of the rumors. And once again, there's also whataboutism, spiced up with the reference to the false rumor of Edward IV killing Henry VI's wife. Let's look at another example. The penultimate sentence is the crucial one. Later Tudor writers turned uncertainty in a definitive murder and laid it firmly at Richard's door. It was not only Tudor writers who identified Richard as the murderer. Mancini, quoted by the Ricardians for example, also writes the following sentence. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who shortly after destroyed Edward's children and then claimed for himself the throne. Then he set his thoughts on removing or at least undermining everything that might stand in the way of him mastering the throne. The protector rushed headlong into crime. But whom will insane lust for power spare if it dares violate the ties of kin and friendship? Mancini avoids the word kill, but it is very clear. Only out of fear for their lives would the lords have offered Richard the crown at all, another quote states. The lords consulted their own safety, warned by the example of Hastings, and perceiving that the alliance of the two dukes, whose power, supported by a multitude of troops, would be difficult and hazardous to resist. The Ricardians do not want to give us any information about the allegations of illegitimacy against Edward IV's children. All this does not mean that the work of the Missing Princess project should be outright rejected. But we must keep it in mind. So, what has the project discovered, and what is the deal with John Evans? In short, it is believed that the Queen made a deal with Richard in 1484 regarding his sons, which she negotiated to be allowed out of the sanctuary. Henry VII is said to have signed this as well. Edward was to renounce his crown in exchange for being allowed to live, but in anonymity. For this, the Queen is said to have written to her son, Thomas Grey, to come back from his exile as he had been pardoned. Edward is said to have lived on land that was under the control of his half-brother in the village of Coleridge in Devon. 2 days later, Richard's faithful servant, Robert Markenfield, appeared here, accompanied by a mysterious person named John Evans. The latter became the Lord of the Manor and the Parker of the Deer Park. Those involved in the project are convinced that John Evans is indeed the boy King Edward. They cite the following clues. First, a window in the local church shows Edward V. This is unusual. Well, at least according to the lead researcher John Dyke. Second, in the corner of the identical window is a portrait of Evans who has the identical scar as Edward. He is looking at the king. The gravestone of Evans contains the letters EVAS. This is not said to be a mishap of simply forgetting the N in Evans' last name. Instead, the letters are said to stand for Edward V and the Latin letters for in sanctuary. If this is true, the name Evans as such would be a clever allusion to the man's true ancestry. Fourth, there is also the word king inverted on the tomb. 9 carved lines are said to represent the year 1509, when Edward could have claimed the throne after the death of the first Tudor king. Fifth, various York symbols are also found in the church. 6. In 1511, Evans had Edward's painting expanded to include a larger crown with 41 stacks. In 1511, Edward V would have been 41 years old. What to make of all this? Some questions arise automatically. What happened to Edward's brother Richard? Why did Edward not claim his throne in 1509 when he obviously placed a lot of emphasis on his actual birthright? And why would he take the risk of being the one to aggressively draw attention to himself? There are also some further questions. As mentioned, the land in question was that of Edward's half-brother Thomas. That the missing king is seen here in a church is not as unusual as Dyke says. Or as the Church Monument Society puts it, John Evans was clearly a trusted employee of Dorset, Edward's half-brother, and if Evans or his family put Edward into a window, it would express loyalty to Dorset as well as to Edward himself. This could also explain the 41 stacks. It need not to have been the person himself to record that Edward would have been 41 years old in 1511. Other researchers also assume it is not Edward V, but Edward the Confessor. Edward would also have to come to Coleridge as a 13-year-old. The question arises whether the young age would not have been worth mentioning. But what about the shield and the inverted king? Again, this maybe was a tribute from a loyal servant to the lost king. It is possible that the shield is really only missing an N, because the Latin letters for in sanctuary would actually be ASA. However, the second A does not exist. The project assumes that it was broken off by vandals. In fact, a piece of the sign is missing. You can clearly see it on the picture. But there is plenty of space between the S and the break. Theoretically, the whole thing could be easily solved by simply testing Evans' DNA. However, his grave is empty. The project does not rule out the possibility that his remains are under the church floor, but Dyke says more evidence is needed. So in this regard, at the moment, the all-important proof cannot be provided. All in all, it is not impossible that Edward V and John Evans were one and the same, but it is by far not as clear as the project makes believe. By no means can we agree with Dyke that the history books must be rewritten. It's too early for that. But will we ever know more precisely? Surprisingly, the answer is maybe yes. Let's talk about it, alongside with the promised ghost stories. It was the king who gave hope that the mystery of the princess in the tower could be solved. The bones found under the stairs of the White Tower must be subjected to DNA analysis for this purpose. This must be allowed by the British monarch. Queen Elizabeth II was against this. She feared that this would unleash a wave of openings of royal tombs in order to carry out further investigations. Her son, Charles III, reportedly sees things differently. Historian Tracy Borman is quoted about the king's stance on this with the following words. He has said he would like an investigation to go ahead so that we can determine once and for all how the young royals died. Allegedly, the monarch even has a vested interest. A TV documentary by the Missing Princess Project is to be released beforehand, which aims to achieve the identical goal. However, before we can address these points, we must deal with another topic, the ghosts of the princes in the tower. Edward V allegedly even tries his hand at being a photobomber. If you believe in ghosts and spirits, come to London, you will love it here. The British metropolis is considered one of the most haunted places in the world. The bloody history of many places in the city may have done outstanding work in this regard. Thus, it is not surprising that the princes in the tower are also said to have reappeared as ghosts soon after their disappearance to haunt the place that became their forever prison. Rumor has it that it was the bloody tower that became the site of their murder. Here, since the 15th century, two small figures wearing night robes have been seen time and time again. They are said to sob and cling to each other. In 1990, however, two guards claim to have heard children laughing as they played outside. There are even said to be photographs of the ghosts. Here is an example of Edward V. It is not the only picture. In 2017, a woman from Liverpool reported she had also photographed the young king when she visited the tower. Here's her shot. The girl in the foreground is the daughter of the woman from Liverpool. The mother told the press the then 16-year-old was worried the ghost had followed her. Personally, I find it a great pity that ghosts can only be photographed blurred and could be reflections of other visitors, but this is only my private opinion. In fact, the princess would not be the only ghost in the tower. No less than 13 spirits have been counted so far. Even Queen Victoria would like to have seen one. But back to what happened to the possible remains of the princess in the tower. As mentioned, there was already an investigation of the bones found in the White Tower. It took place in 1933. The investigation found that the age at the time of death would match that of the princess. It was also determined that the bones belonged to relatives. However, the scientists could not determine the sex. They also found traces of a painful disease on the jaw of the older remains, which would have deformed the face and could have led to death. Edward V is not known to have suffered from such a disease. At least that is what was originally said. Unfortunately, the scientists Ken and Wright, who were allowed to conduct the investigation in 1933, did a sloppy job. In fact, Edward was treated for such a disease, fitting the findings. In general, the scientists were very hasty in their work. Wright, for example, judged earlier on that a reddish-brown stain on the bone was a blood splatter of the kind resulting from suffocation. He is said to have immediately assumed, despite contrary circumstantial evidence, that it was the remains of the princess. Here are the photographs taken of the bones at the time. Let's return to the present to conclude. Here we must first answer an awkward question. If Charles supports a DNA test, why hasn't anything happened yet? He has been king for a while after all. Woman provides clarification. She had been misquoted. She had merely heard rumors that Charles wanted to proceed accordingly. So was all hope in vain? No, unfortunately not. In the spring of 2023, it was again confirmed that Charles supported a corresponding project in principle. King studied theology at Cambridge University and is therefore very interested in historical issues himself. It remains to be seen when the DNA tests will happen. The Missing Princess project will hope that it will take a while before the tests start. Philippa Langley and Rob Reiner, for their part, eventually intend to conclusively demonstrate that they have solved the mystery in their new TV documentary about the princess. The documentary will be called The Lost Princess. I think it is sure we will once again encounter the name John Evans as the solution. All that remains for me to say at the end of this video is, hope you found it interesting and have made up your own minds about what really happened. Thank you for joining me and staying with me. See you next time.